Good afternoon, and it is my pleasure to interview Phil Pacey, who has had a long career in transportation as an advisor, as a board member, as a CFO, and starting in 2016 as a partner of AMP's asset management group. And more importantly, Phil is a veteran of the marine money stage. So with that, Phil, can you tell us a little bit about AMP and the infrastructure team there?
Thanks, Jim. Yes, with pleasure. AMP Capital are one of the top 10, I think, infrastructure funds globally. We invest in four main themes: in transportation, in energy, in healthcare, and in communications assets. We're very, very strict about the assets that we invest in. They have to meet certain infrastructure criteria. That tends to be long assets with long contracts. They tend to have some form of market protection, and obviously we're looking for returns for investors that are appropriate to those risks. So we're one of the leading infrastructure funds globally.
Now, so you arrived in 2016, very similar to the time that AMP invested in ESVAGT.
Yes.
And I guess if I do this over and over again, I'll eventually pronounce that correctly. Tell us about that journey.
Yes. ESVAGT is it came out of Maersk Group. It was sideways off from the original Maersk Group, and it originally was a company that concentrated on safety and support at sea, on vessels supporting oil and gas installations and drilling. But since our time with ESVAGT, we've migrated the company successfully into offshore wind, such that we're the global leader in providing the offshore wind vessels that support the maintenance phase of offshore wind farms. That journey has been very interesting for me. I'm employed as the asset manager, so I'm there to look after our investments in companies once they've been acquired. I look to work very closely with the management teams and with the board members to try and transform the companies and to create value. That's my expertise. I get very, very close to the companies. In ESVAGT's case, I spent 3 months in Denmark once we'd acquired it, looking at their business processes, looking at their markets, looking at their strategy, and helping management develop that for the future. And so we're very, very pleased with this asset. As I say, it's migrated into the market leader in a particular niche in offshore wind. We're very proud of that.
Okay, so AMP has a history of buying it, changing it, improving it, growing it, and selling it.
Absolutely, yes. We don't
so
buy.
Here we are in 2021. So bring us up to date with the 2021 part of this journey story.
Well, 2021 looks very rosy for ESVAGT, and of course that's because we've transitioned the company into supporting offshore wind, and offshore wind is going to be a huge growth industry. It's not only got to be a huge growth industry in Europe and in the North Sea, with countries around that basin, the UK, France, Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, all investing and making commitments to grow offshore wind. But now especially, we've got this exciting prospect in the US, especially off the eastern seaboard, of offshore wind really becoming a serious industry. And of course, that's very exciting for us in ESVAGT.
So tell us a little bit about the joint venture with Crowley now.
Well, that has been announced, and I think there are various reasons why a joint venture is attractive. First and foremost, I think Crowley are a very, very exciting partner, and we're absolutely thrilled to be partnering with them. They're a very substantial player in the US market. They obviously have very good connections to the construction yards for vessels in the US, and they've got tremendous operating experience. But more importantly, as you know, when two companies come together, they have similar values about how things should be at sea, what level of safety is required, and how things generally are approached. And we're very, very happy with the marriage of the values. On top of that, this is going to be a huge growth industry, and this is going to require a lot of capital. And we obviously needed a partner who had the appetite to build a company of scale and to deploy much more capital in this sector. And Crowley certainly, as I know already, have a tremendous appetite for deploying capital into this sector. And then, of course, thirdly, there's the Jones Act, which requires that the companies are indeed controlled by parties that are US citizen owned. And therefore, of course, this is a marriage of convenience for ESVAGT in that they were required to find a US partner.
Take us through the Jones Act hurdle in a little bit more detail.
Well, I think, you know, I'm not a total expert on the Jones Act, and I'm sure many of those attending today are, but there are some key principles, I think. Companies have to be controlled by US citizens. I think key assets that are built, in this case, new vessels, have to be built in the US. And in terms of the seafarers who are operating, they have to be employed by US companies. So there's quite strict criteria, I think, to form a joint venture in a company that is compliant and that the US Coast Guard will accept as compliant with the Jones Act. And therefore, of course, we've had to be very, very particular about how the joint venture is structured.
So AMP obviously has lots of benefits as it relates to financing. Not everyone in the offshore wind space is in the same luxurious position. You know, certainly bank financing is difficult with lengthy construction periods and waiting on contracts. The bond markets have yet to be meaningfully tested at this point. Take us through the financing perspective, and obviously this is an advantage for MP, but take us through the sort of the risk reward around the financing.
I think ESVAGT has a number of advantages in this sector. Starting with the day-to-day operations, it does generate positive cash flows. It is already a company of substance, and therefore it has a track record that investors can look at, and it has forward projections that I think investors can get comfortable with. So this is a company that's already grown to a certain size and is something that investors can actually undertake proper due diligence on with a degree of confidence. I think that's sort of point one. Then point two, these are long contracts. These contracts for the offshore vessels tend to be 5, 10, 15 years. And they tend to be AAA, AA clients. You know, we're talking about some of the top utility companies or indeed the turbine manufacturers. So obviously the banks can get very, very comfortable with the level of risk of the revenue flows that come from these contracts. So that's the second thing. Well, we've also got this market that's expanding, and therefore when it comes to the vessels going on contract again for a second and a third time, we're looking at a hugely expanding market that these vessels are being put into, which, as you know, gives a hell of a lot of comfort to investors. And then on top of that, as another layer, we've got AMP Capital and 3i Infrastructure as the joint owners of ESVAGT, who have their size and substance and scope and their reputations in the debt markets, especially because we have a portfolio of assets across many of the major infrastructure debt providers, and clearly we have our reputations at stake in terms of these companies being well managed and the debt and the interest being protected. So I think it's a multi-layered level of comfort, Jim, which not all of our competitors are able to offer.
So AMP, historically, your marriages last 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
Professionally.
Yeah.
And we're now 5 years into this.
Yeah.
But you're still very bullish.
We're still there. We're still very bullish, but we do have an investment period. That's the nature of our business model. And obviously in time, we will look to sell our shares in the business. And obviously we'll be looking for a buyer who's excited by the prospect of offshore wind, excited by the prospect of deploying a lot more capital into this industry. Because actually offshore wind and the renewables is not a straightforward sector to get into and put capital into with infrastructure type assets. A lot of the assets in the sector are much higher risk, higher reward. So this is a little bit of a niche within the sector as a whole, and clearly there's capital looking for that opportunity. And obviously we'll be looking in due course to find someone with that capital who would like to invest in a top company, which is ESVAGT.
So we look at the Western world, and we've got the UK over here with incredible wind projects and wind goals. And then we've got Europe next to it and the US over here somewhere. Do you think consensus estimates, which are nowhere near where the UK is, do you think consensus estimates are bullish enough on the offshore wind? Okay, tell us about it.
No, I just think when a nation gets comfortable with this as an industry, and when they see the carbon numbers of this industry, and they're looking at alternatives, and they look at the scale that offshore wind can provide, and obviously the US, obviously Canada, obviously Australia and New Zealand, as well as Japan and Korea and China, you know, this industry has already proven that it's got the scope to be a major part of ongoing energy production. And of course, the industry has been working hard to bring its costs down, such that it's much more economic than it was 5 to 10 years ago. So these new markets that are going to invest in offshore wind are going to get the benefits of those operational efficiencies. And clearly there's more to come, of course. But it really is a much more cost-effective industry than it was 5 to 10 years ago.
So you think the world's gonna evolve closer to the UK goals over the next decade?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't just put the UK out on its own. I think the UK and a large portion of Europe. So I think this vision has migrated around Europe, and European countries and companies are buying into it.
Excellent. You've had a long history in transportation.
Yeah.
Marine Money has had a long history in marine. We're not used to segments being undersupplied. In terms of possible bottlenecks for this industry in the next decade, is there a risk that we'll be undersupplied in terms of the vessels needed to do these projects?
No, I think the supply chain will deliver. And you know, there are many parts to the supply chain for offshore wind. I think the turbine companies will deliver. I think the utilities, you know, want to get into this. I think the marine suppliers during the construction phase, during the operational phase, will deliver. I think, you know, the bottleneck up until now in the US has obviously been environmental approval, and we quite understand that building families of wind farms offshore, the fishing industry, the whale migrations, and all these other factors have got to be fully assessed and understood before this industry gets green light. So I think that's been an understandable bottleneck, but obviously I think everyone is hoping now that we're going to be on green lights and we're going to move forward.
Phil, we're coming to the end of our time. I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you again for joining Marine Money. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Jim, and I hope the panel is very interesting to all those listening in. Thank you very much.